For years, my relationship with Malina consisted of awkward meetings, absolute follies, and the biggest possible misunderstandings. I mean, of course, much greater misunderstandings than with other people. Certainly I was subordinate to him from the beginning, and I must have known early on that he was destined to be my doom, that Malina's place was already occupied by Malina, even before he entered my life. I was only spared, or perhaps I spared myself, meeting him too soon, for there were numerous occasions at the E2 and H2 streetcar stop by the Stadtpark when something could have happened and almost did. There he stood holding a newspaper. I acted as if I didn't see him, although I kept staring over my paper in his direction, without flinching. I couldn't tell whether he was really so engrossed in the news, or whether he had noticed my pinning him, hypnotizing him, wanting to force him to look up. Me forcing him, I thought. If the E2 comes first, everything will be fine, but heaven forbid the unfriendly H2 or the even rarer G2 should arrive first. Finally, the E2 did indeed pull up, but by the time I had jumped onto the second car, Malina had vanished. He wasn't to be found in the first car or in my own, and he hadn't remained behind. He must have dashed into the Stadtbahn station just as I had to turn around. After all, he couldn't have dissolved into thin air. My whole day was ruined since I couldn't find an explanation, kept looking for him, and was as much perplexed by his behaviour as by my own. That was ages ago, and today there's not enough time to talk about it. Years later, the same thing happened in a lecture hall in Munich. He was suddenly standing next to me, took a few steps forward against a shove of students, searched for a seat, and then retreated while I listened, kept very alert by my fear of passing out, for 1.5 hours to a lecture on art in the age of technology. While looking for Malina amid this mass of people forced to sit still and be moved by the speaker. On that evening I realised beyond a doubt that I could not count on art, technology, or this age to help me in any way, and that I would never have anything to do with the thoughts, themes, or problems under discussion. I was also convinced I wanted Malina, and that whatever I desired to know must come from him. In the end I applauded abundantly like everyone else. Then 2 people from Munich helped me to the back of the hall and showed me the way out. One held my arm, while the other kept saying intelligent things to me. Others joined in, and I kept looking over to Malina, likewise moving toward the back door, but slowly enough to allow me to gain some speed. It was then I performed the impossible. I rammed into him as if someone had pushed me, or as if I had tripped, and down I fell, right on top of Malina. This way he couldn't help but notice me, though I'm not sure he really saw me. I did hear his voice for the first time, though, calm and proper, on one note. Excuse me. That is one of the early passages there from Ingeborg Bachmann's 1971 novel, Malina. And that's for the English translation from 1990 by Philip Bohm. This, in brief, before I get into the cryptic complexities of this novel, this is a book about a female writer and her relationships with 2 men, Malina and Ivan, Malina being introverted and Ivan sort of being joyous. And that's the large bulk of it, other than the middle chapter, which deals with the protagonist's relationship with her father and Austrian themes of World War II and guilt. But generally, it's a book about the relationship between men and women. It's about guilt, mental illness, writing, personal trauma, and the specifically sort of Austrian relationship with World War II and the guilt that comes with that. So as many of you will know, to sort of ground this novel, because I've had to go back and forth with it for a while now, I'm reluctant to read introductions to books, especially fiction. If there's introductions, I tend to skip them, and maybe I'll read them afterwards, or maybe won't read them at all. But usually I skip them because I don't like to have an introduction. Often taints what you would have personally just found from the book. And I usually do that with philosophy as well. But in this case, 10, 15 pages into the book, I found myself really wondering where I was, really finding myself feeling as if I was existing within an alien, just entirely different way of being, way of trying to understand things, and that typical thought of whether or not I've missed something key, which comes from certain books. So I flicked back to the introduction, which is by Rachel Kushner, and a couple of little excerpts from Rachel Kushner here. What I encountered in that book, which is this one and yet not, because I will never again be the age at which I first read it, was a portrait in language of female consciousness, truer than anything written since Sappho's Fragment 31. And then, quoting Thomas Bernhard, she says, "I loved Bachmann a great deal," fellow Austrian writer Thomas Bernhard once told an interviewer. "She was a very intelligent woman. Strange combination, no? Most women are stupid but bearable, possibly even agreeable, intelligent too, but rarely." And then Kushner herself goes on, "Can a man understand this book? Completely. No less than a woman can understand Thomas Bernhard. A man can appreciate Malina. He doesn't have to suffer it. While a woman who reads this book might feel the same burns and itching from the wool dress the narrator puts on, late in the narrative, not by choice, by cosmic attrition, as her possessions start to go missing. But Malina is not a novel that is easy for anyone to understand, in a normal sense of comprehension, the who, what, and why. I won't pretend. It's a difficult book in which to find your footing. There are all sorts of references in it to Schoenberg, to Vienna, to historical events, not all of which the reader will catch. But once you're in, you're in. You're not decoding. This helped me out. There's two things here. First and foremost is that it's not a straightforward novel about the novel narrator's relationship with two men. It's not simply a straightforward novel about relationships or love, something like that. But equally, that peculiar feeling was, as Kushner makes clear there, this is a book of female consciousness. And her inclusion of the quote by Bernhard, where Bernhard is being rather coy about Bachmann, because in reality, Ingeborg Bachmann was a tutor, in a certain sense, to Bernhard in terms of his writing. And I think Bernhard there is being rather sarcastic. But the inclusion of that into the introduction, to then follow that up and say, can a man understand this book completely, in such the same way that a woman can understand Bernhard, is, I think, a rather tongue-in-cheek gesture towards the fact, possibly, of my own feeling of being rather lost. I could understand what was going on empirically, and of course I can understand that the protagonist is getting on different trains and moving into a train station and lives in an apartment, and yet all the while there is a form of relationship with the world that is there in the text but completely unable for me to be able to be seen, as if I missing some sort of biological apparatus as a means to be able to even apprehend it. And that, I believe, is what Kushner is gesturing towards in terms of the female consciousness writing effect of Bachmann, is that this is distinctly a book that, in approaching it as either a man or a woman, one is going to have an emphatically different appreciation or understanding of the text. And it almost appears as if there is little to be done about that. But speaking as a man, that has in itself been an extremely interesting approach in terms of engagement, entering into a world where the protagonist, who is unnamed and is simply just I, is literally an I that is solely an I built or self built from relations to Malina, to Ivan, and then in the second chapter to her father, built solely from those rather tense, threated and frictional relationships that are always feel very bound. And, you know, equally, biographically, there is a mirroring of certain points for Bachmann's own life. So with chapter 2, we find this long, a little bit weaker chapter about the narrator's father and World War II, with Bachmann's own father being part of the Nazi party, and once again emphasizing that sort of form of guilt that was key to the Austrian civilization. But I will go briefly go through the plot, give another reading, and then we can really, I'll try and dig in a bit more. So we have this unnamed narrator, and once that begins really with an irony that the novel is named after one of the men of the book, even though technically the protagonist is this unnamed female narrator. The novel itself is named after Malina, and so the existence of this whole thing is really predicated upon just this tension, as if as soon as the men cease to exist, the female protagonist would cease to exist. It's ultimately about the existential situation of this woman who's a writer, about what dialogue and about what her existence looks like in this sense, specifically within Vienna and within a certain context of Vienna, within the post-World War II, post-war Vienna in the second half of the 20th century. There's a very specific Austrian breed of writer from that era that was writing really great things. You'll probably notice that I'm on an Austrian literature kick with I've now read everything of Bernhard, but also with Fleur Yegi and the recent review of The Wall, and so Bachmann's Malina is very much part of this reaction to that, except with this feminist gender angle of Malina. So this writer shares a flat with the sort of introverted and calm Malina, who is a historian, who offers her support when she's confused and seems to be losing touch with reality, which we'll get to. She then meets Ivan, who is a young Hungarian, very sort of joyous and a bit more extroverted, though the binary, the seeming binary, black and white binary between them there isn't as pronounced. And she falls in love with him. They begin an affair, and then soon Ivan begins to avoid her and ultimately rejects her. Then we have the second chapter, which is called The Third Man, which is sort of the climax of the narrative. Dream sequences, the horrors of the Second World War, scenarios in relation to gas chambers, scenarios of rape, and the father figure is just astoundingly pronounced as this oppressive symbol of male domination throughout this chapter. And then in the third chapter, there's a sort of attempt to overcoming and a sort of an attempt toward realization of her position as a woman in relation to existing really as only within those relationships with men. Now, to read out the plot in that sense is a bit of is a little bit false, because for both men and women to read this book, there is a cryptic nature to it, and there is a hostile, teasing nature to it, and a maestro-like effect of the prose. So the plot, like many of the books I review, to say that the plot just plods forward like that is really false. These things are found little snippets here or there. This is a cryptic book which is constantly making it clear, look, you're not going to get any answers. The world itself is always folded back on itself. So with the protagonist, with this notion of female consciousness, we have like a tripling effect, where we have the clearly self-conscious Ingeborg Bachmann relating her biographical experiences as a woman post-World War II Austria via a nameless female protagonist who is only in a metatextual sense existent because of her explicitly writing about her relationships with men, in a book that makes it clear very quickly doesn't particularly have a point as to why it's being written. You know, the nameless narrator herself is a writer herself, and so what we find is something that is skillfully confused, skillfully cryptic. The novel it most reminds me of in terms of what it's doing stylistically is actually Nabokov's Lolita. So in Nabokov's Lolita, we have Nabokov's ability as a writer to carry us forward within the reprehensible worldview of the narrator. But his ability as a stylist is just constantly carrying us forward because the style and the prose is immaculate. The same thing applies with Bachmann, of course in a different sense in terms of content, but Bachmann's ability as a stylist allows us as readers to basically want to continue to spend time in what is not a sort of harrowing, hellish world in the sense of something exciting, but an absolutely Austrianly grey, miserable, concrete, post-war, guilt-ridden, ill world. This world is emphatically sick. It's really ill, but it's a banal illness. And Bachmann's style, Bachmann's control of prose carries us forward, and it's like a terminally ill page turner. You know, it's a page turner. You question why you're continuing to turn the page, and you realize it's her ability as a writer that really means you keep going forward. And so another little excerpt. Against the decay and order, against life and against death, against accident, constant threats from the radio, the newspaper headlines of spreading the plague, against perfidy seeping down from upstairs or up from downstairs, against a slow devouring inside and being swallowed up by the outside, against Frau Breitner's insulted airs each morning, I hold my position, keep my early evening watch and wait and smoke, increasingly confident and safe with unprecedented endurance and security, because in this sign I shall conquer. And so there is a sense that the protagonist is holding herself. And so, as I've already mentioned, this nameless I is existent really just from pressured relationships, the position she finds herself in within the world. And this is where the illness factor really begins to arise, because mental illness is a serious drudgery of the mental illness begins to develop in this book in a horrible way. And it's because of that triple layer effect that I already mentioned, with Bachmann self-knowing into this unnamed I in relation to everything else. The self-acknowledgement of the narrator to know our own position but still continue forward begets a sort of eternal return of illness, where you don't really know where anyone stands, and there's no not necessarily no agency, but there's no telos, there's nothing that's really being gone towards for many of the people in the novel. And that form of illness and of a sort of self-denial of that position really builds into something harrowingly unwell. And this is sort of seasoned, to use a really crass word there, with these, in a way, pieces of poetry. Bachmann herself being known more popularly as a poet, where we have one side of a conversation from the unnamed protagonist or narrator. And, you know, to give you an example, I just have to get the ashtray. Just a minute, me too. Have you lit one as well? There, now. No, it's not working. Don't you have any matches? I just used the last. No, I don't. On the candle. You hear that? Hey, get off our line, would you? This phone has its little ticks. What? Somebody's still jabbering away. You're sick. I said ticks. It's not important. Ticks with a T. I don't understand. You're feeling sick. I'm sorry, it was the wrong word. Why wrong? What do you mean? Nothing. Just that when you repeat a word so often. And little excerpts like that throughout the book really emphasize the solitary ill nature of this novel. In the background, in a certain sense, is a conversation regarding love. You know, whether or not there's really a possibility for that here, whether or not a woman in this position can truly be whether or not the discussion, which I'll get a bit more to about the surrender to the negative in a second. I'll read one more excerpt regarding what I mean about whether or not love can really happen within this world. This is from very early on. Since everything between us has happened as it has, the only thing I still have to ask myself is, what can we be for each other? Malina and I, since we're so distinct, so unalike. And this isn't a question of sex or kind, the stability of his existence, the instability of my own. Of course, Malina has never lived as compulsively as I have. He's never wasted his time on trivialities by phoning around, letting events take over. He's never gotten into trouble, much less spent half an hour staring at himself in the mirror only to rush off somewhere, always late, stammering excuses, perplexed by a question or embarrassed by an answer. I guess even today we don't have much to do with one another. We put up with each other, are mutually amazed, but my amazement is curious. Is Malina really ever amazed? Less and less, I think. And this tension, precisely, because my presence never upsets him, since he acknowledges it as he pleases and doesn't bother when there's nothing to say, as if we weren't constantly passing each other in the apartment, impossible to overlook, performing everyday actions impossible to ignore. Then it seems to me that his calm comes from my ego being too familiar, too unimportant for him, as if he had rejected me as waste, a superfluous something made human, as if I were merely the dispensable product of his rib. But at the same time an unavoidable dark tale accompanying and hoping to supplement his own bright story, a tale that he, however, detaches and delimits. Thus I am the only one who has anything to settle, and above all I must and can explain myself, but only to him. He has nothing to settle? No, not him. I'm cleaning up in the front hall. I want to be near the door because he'll be here any minute. The key moves inside the door. I step back so he won't knock me down. He locks the door behind him and simultaneously, kindly, we greet one another. Hello. And so, okay, it's an unfortunate description of a confused and lie-filled, haphazard, banal relationship between two people that very well is resting largely upon the foundation of comfort and not wanting to move towards discomfort. Yet for our narrator, it's become one where she's unable to understand herself at all without what she is for Malina. And so we have a choice as a reader. I think the choice is about something I've already mentioned, which is the parallels in a way with Lolita and the decision of the reader to surrender or become subordinate even to the negative of this world, to this sort of grey sludge-like existence that is riddled with illness and a sort of low-level strange guilt. But at the same time, in our engagement as a reader, we engage in the same strange, passive, dragging on through life as the narrator themselves. We're with her as much as we can be, but she is very unwell. But it's the lyrical language, it's the prose that somehow convinces us to keep going. Something about the world, something about just wanting to be there to see whether or not this will go anywhere, which sounds strange. But the book in itself then also presents itself as a puzzle, as something that might be worked out. But this is where the illness factor really doubles down, is that in the same sense that the unnamed narrator doesn't really kind of know all along that she's only really being defined as in relation to the tensions of relationships with other men. Equally, all this this underlying unconscious notion that something is to be worked out, all the while also knows that this weird puzzle that's been created is absolutely false. There's nothing to be worked out here. And yet it is this false puzzle that keeps us as the reader going forward. What is there to be worked out here? And it also keeps the unnamed narrator going forward. There's no solutions that are hidden by the author, and this is made apparent. And so it's in that notion of really, the idea of the human being a contradiction that is a definition itself of illness, of not giving oneself over to either side, but trying to figure out how to be both things, how to figure out these relations in that way. And so the illness really bolsters itself by addressing the inability of its own solutions ceaselessly. And so what we're left with is a decision simply to also subordinate ourselves as a reader to the drudgery and the strangely lyrical swamp that is the novel Malina. And yeah, it's an extremely strange book that I will never figure out on multiple levels. But there's also an overwhelming sense, speaking as a man, that a woman may pick this up and the answers are already there, and that being written as something of female consciousness, that why would you be trying to even figure anything out here? It's plain to see what this is. And of course, this is the trick with the book's name itself, the great irony that, why is it called Malina when we immediately open the book, we find that it's about an unnamed narrator, and Malina is one of the men, that she herself has become a secondary character to her own life. And we, in a way, at that point, become a secondary reader who is once again being not necessarily dragged, subordinating ourselves to a secondary life that is just being pulled along, and there's never going to be a eureka moment, and things begin to lose coherence. When I speak of the ill and sickly effect of this novel, I really should emphasize that it builds and builds, not in terms of intensity, but in terms of its complexity. That there's points where you know empirically absolutely what's going on. We're sat in a certain place with a certain person, and yet the mind has become so detached from various realities that really we've got no idea what's going on. And so what we cling to is just some rhythm that is given to us by Bachmann herself, this very crystalline, the language is a crystalline lake, akin to Yegi, who I reviewed before, but a little less minimal with a little bit more rhythm. But it's this ability specifically of the Austrians to just have this page-turning language. An Austrian could convince you to just keep walking through hell for the sightseeing, even though you consistently acknowledge the terrors and the harrowing and the cold bitterness of the surroundings. Something about Austrian literature manages to just continue to go, look, just keep going, another step, another page. And you do, and you're given over to that illness, both in that process and also by acknowledging the fact you're doing that. It's a book that is maddeningly convincing you of very little at all. But it's also convincing of madness. It's excessive in many ways. It's at points so close to being cheap, but isn't. And it is ultimately, I would just describe it as strange, not in the sense of weird literature, but in the sense of one of those peculiar books that is written in such a specific style and such a specific way that it truly allows one to lightly experience a different form of being for a short time, and somehow manages to keep them in that place. I don't have too much more to say about it, other to say I enjoyed it. It's a very wintry, cold novel, but it's fascinating to me that something could be written in such a sense that there are many who I think just maybe they'll be able to understand it 99%, but that 100%, and I think Kushner is being a bit tongue-in-cheek about this in the introduction, as I said, that full, complete understanding is something intuitive that comes from an experience that is completely other or simply is. I don't think there's some literary theory or decision that could make you understand it. This is like it's an understanding that comes from circumstance, and without that can't be learned. And so for many people, this novel constantly, ceaselessly pulling you into this miserable Austrian post-war guilt and world of a woman in Austria at this point in time, and yet there is always an elusive female Sappho-like liminal hand holding you at bay if you don't have the intuitive, experiential passphrase, past experience. And if you don't, then there's something about this book that is ultimately, can we say, genderly mystifying in an extremely intriguing way. But that is my short thoughts really on Ingeborg Bachmann's Malina. But it's another in the what is slowly becoming a long line of Austrian literature, which I just absolutely adore. I think Austrian literature of that era is just fantastic. But that is Ingeborg Bachmann's Malina, and I hope you enjoyed my thoughts. Thanks very much.